Cootsy's dad always had a suit on, from bedside to bedside. Mr. W. Waddy, Shepherdstown's train station man for some 34 years, finished his pancakes at his home in New Street. Just as his wife Julia passes the pancakes around to Julian, Peg, Bill, Polly, and Blackford, who the other boys called Cootsy. It's June 1927. The kids are out of school, and Dad gets up. Julia gives him a kiss at the door.
I would not marry a farmer, he's always in the dirt. But I would marry an engineer who wears a striped shirt. A railroader mother, a railroader for me. If ever I marry in all my life, a railroader's bride I'll be.
Now Julia, she was a Blackford. She met Wade after he'd come up from Island Ford, Virginia. They married and they came here. They rented in 22 in Hartzell's house down on the county road, and then they bought their own place here on New Street. They had to keep the windows closed because of the kids. There was an Episcopal priest living just across the street. Mr. Waddy walks down New Street, past the Billmeyers, where Cootsy's best buddy Cameron lived. Now, Mrs. Billmeyer knew that if her clock didn't say 7:30 when Mr. Waddy came by as a shadow on her window, she knew that the clock was wrong and Mr. Waddy was right, because he set the time for God and all the heavenly angels. W. Waddy glances over at the Hodges lemon grain elevator in the coal yard to see if some coal cars on the siding were unloaded yet. Pocahontas coal was in the bin. His boss, the Norfolk and Western, owned some of those fields. Mr. Willoughby Lemon took over the elevator from Van Meter, who took it over from Kearney. Old Sam Hodges had a store down on the corner. At the station, the children rise up out of the dusty street, as one put it, like lean, dusty, tattered mammalians. And they're smiling up at him in the shirts made from the feed store sacks and sheared off pants and sheared off skirts and barefoot and peeking up at him from under those big straw hats. They loved Mr. Waddy and all his magic powers. He made the train stop and go with just the wave of a hand. Now Polly, Cootsy's sister, was so proud of her daddy that she'd bring all her friends down to the station just to look at him. W.W. Waddy talked with the kids. He apprised them and advised them. Kids, the Spanish nuts in the dispense has been there a good while. The chocolate has worms too, I reckon. Stick with the chiclets in those tiny little boxes, kids. Each kid really wanted to get away from the engineer on the next train, hopefully. Each dreamed of being the very next Henry Selby. You see, Pendleton, or Penn Zeiler, was the first engineer on this line, and he drove the first train into Shepherdstown. Penn called his train the Madam, and he shined the brass on her so you could see your big old nose in it. Once, when the Madam was in for repairs, just as he always would do, he would sit it out and wait for her return. Now once, the Madam's cab was wrecked and was rolling down an embankment near Warren, Virginia. They went there, they were trying to find people who were injured, and they finally found old Penn. He was sitting on some cross ties, all drippy and bawling. "What's the matter, Penn? You hurt?" He looked back and says, "No, I'm not hurt. Nobody's hurt, but just look at the Madam." He started crying all over again. Now, the point here is this. Henry Selby got up into Penn Zeiler's cab, and he let him do it. But poor Henry, they say, got so excited when the whistle gave a hoot, he just jumped like a little cat and fell off the cab's ladder to the ground. So now this Saturday's going to be busy. Not a time to play checkers over the telegraph kind of day, you could say. Students coming up from the south to go to St. James further on, and Shepherd College's summer school is starting. That'd be Tuesday the 14th. Some 300 are registered. They might be coming by train, on the other hand. Waddy thought they might be taking cars because they just finished a nice road from Romney.
Dear Peggy, when the train pulled out of the home station and I could scarcely see you or the rest through my tears, I was almost sorry I was going to Shepherd College. It just seemed as though I was leaving all that was dear to me and going out into the world by myself, and the world looked pretty big and lonesome. I didn't feel that way long, though, for some jolly girls and boys got on the train at Green Spring, and I soon found that they were going to Shepherd College, too. Some of them were from Romney, some were from Petersburg, and some from Moorfield. They talked about the good times they had at school last year, and I soon began to cheer up and think I'd like it for sure. We had to wait several hours at a little town, jumping off place. The boy called it Shenandoah Junction. You see, the Baltimore and Ohio doesn't come through Shepherdstown, so we had to change here for the Norfolk and Western. We felt that we were close to Shepherdstown. It's only 6 miles away. We watched rather eagerly for our train, which presently came jogging along in easy southern fashion. The conductor got off and sauntered about the station, and when we saw him sauntering back, like a stagecoach driver ready to take his lines again, we jumped on.
Now one girl named Reva Copenhaver, she came for summer school and Shepherdstown for the first time in her life. and they all cried and waved goodbye from the station in Carneysville. Mr. Waddy, he hangs up his coat and sits down at his big bay room desk. All his regulation books are on the wall to the left, and over his shoulder on the right is the ticket window. Beside his legs is that big blue jar of distilled water with the wires running from it up to his telegraph keys. He telegraphs the other stations just to let them know that he got in. Now, today's Baltimore Sun should be on the very next train. Early tomorrow morning, the number 13 southbound will drop off for Doc Gibson's store a shipment of the Sunday New York Times. Waddy just loved the news. He listened to the radio every night. Douglas Edwards. Outside the station, Rolly Shaw, the Railway Express man, had his grandson Jim up from Washington, D.C. to help him out this summer. They'd most likely be spending most of that day lugging the students' big trunks up narrow staircases. Old Dick, the horse, he was backing the wagon in with Ben Whiting steering him on. His old driver was Jim Barnhart. But, this new hurried world wasn't Jim's world. All those packages from Sears and Roebuck just flooded in, and his hearing was just about gone, too. Jim's painting of his wagon a bright fire engine red, well, didn't just make it go any faster. The two waiting rooms were filling up now. 8-year-old Gordy Clark and his grandmother, Ellen Robinson, they waited for the local to Hagerstown. On those hot days, cinders were sure to get in your eyes through the open train windows, so Ellen carried tiny flax seeds. Put one under your lower eyelid when you go to sleep, and that seed would gyrate all night around your eyeball, and you'd find the cinder and the seed in the corner of your eye by morning. Mr. Waddy is chatting with the folks he knew, which was everybody, while he sold tickets. Cars were an easy topic, like the weather. One bad day in July back in 26, there were 3 car wrecks hereabout that killed people. Just the same, nothing will ever quite equal Mrs. Needy's funeral back in 1919. Coming down the road from the Reformed Church, they say the undertaker's car got hit right there at the station crossing. The engineer's front cowcatcher carried Mrs. Needy's coffin over 100 feet. And then Mrs. Needy, God rest her soul, popped out of the box and lay nice and ladylike trackside. Laid out all pretty, without a single mark, and she's still holding a rose to her stone-cold chest. Oh, my. Thoughts do drift while waiting for a train. One's gaze might pass over the ruins where the old Lutheran church stood, but then it burned down 3 years ago. And then you might start thinking about all the fires that came from sparks from a train engine. Something burned down Whiting's Mill up on Washington Street, and it was right near the track. The people at the N&W fessed up with one fella and paid him for his house when it burned down. But all this fire talk, it always ends up back in 1912, when the whole town could have burned down. Took a chunk of buildings out on German Street, and it was thanks to the N&W that it didn't. Our good mayor, U.S. Martin, phoned the mayor in Hagerstown, and together they got a fire engine down here on a railroad flatbed, and it got here in just 25 minutes. This particular conversation came up pretty regular. Second only to, why did they close that old freight station and move Mr. Waddy up here? Mr. Waddy himself, he would say, we got amalgamated. used to be that Frank Merritt, who was Waddy's cousin, sold the tickets here while Waddy managed all of it from the other station, the one on the south of town where the Canoes unloaded coal. The Shenandoah Valley Railroad built that station way back in 1879 and then threw in a big repair shop. Today it's Mr. Goldsborough's apple packing house. Amalgamation. To Mr. Waddy was what you get when the government's ICC made the N&W overcharge. He said the N&W had to keep a bottom line minimum 6.5%. So they had to cut jobs and raise the rates just to get up to that. So you jack up the rates by half over 7 years, and what do you get? People taking cars and tricycles and bicycles and anything but the train, and Mr. Waddy's waiting station gets more empty. Amalgamation. Best be called cutting your own railroading throat. It's one darned irony to see 4 big men carefully using jacks to ease a new solid Ford Model A off a railroad flatbed. Confound it. Mr. Waddy lit his cigar. Maybe if he just didn't think about it too much, it wouldn't worry him so. Anyhow, everything was moved to the new brick station, including Mr. Waddy. And Mr. Waddy now sold the tickets, oversaw the freight business, and handled the telegrams for Western Union. And you didn't ever want to pick up the phone and hear that serious voice that Mr. Waddy put on. The news would always be bad. Real bad. The number 28 from the junk is due in. It's almost 9:35. But first, a slow northbound freight's approaching. Mr. Waddy already had on his hat and his coat with the brass buttons. He stood at the track, his long arm is high, holding the bamboo hoop for the moving brakeman to loop his arm through it. And there's a note snapped onto it. Then the hoop is dropped down the track. As Mr. Waddy telegraphed to the next Antietam station about this freight, a big whistle moaned to the south. The number 28 came into view, belching black smoke, the bell clanging and hissing streaks of white steam shooting from the cylinders. I could see Dick Cash, the shoemaker, guarding the crossing.
If I hadn't studied the catalog so faithfully, the station would have led me to believe Shepherdstown was a city of about 20,000 instead of a little town of 1,500. It's a large brick building with driveways on 3 sides and a long train shed on the front.
Mr. Waddy took out his gold Waltham watch as the engine neared. "She's right on time," he said, closing it with his thumb and finger. Squealing mobs of kids waved to the grinning engineer in his royal perch. Waddy showed the engineer where to stop the baggage car so they could pull up the 3 large hand-pulled carts. Faces at all the open windows look and search, and then smile and wave at the found face. The train stopped, and the magisterial conductor stepped from the train, placing a little footstool on the platform. The neatly dressed engineer came down with a long-necked oil can and began squirting oil on the wheel bearings. People like the conductor and the brakeman knew strange and wonderful things about magic lands. I watched with interest that brought dreams of a swifter action somewhere. Another man went along the train, checking each of the wheels for hot boxes that needed oil. And Mr. Waddy, he joined Raleigh Shaw, Jim, and Ben Whiting in pulling the wagons up to the open baggage car that was full of geese and tires, coffins, furniture, and sometimes a special bag of money for Jefferson Security Bank. One time, Rolly let Jim carry one with $10,000 in it up German Street. The passengers stepped down, met, hugged, departed. Passengers alighted and stepped on board with tickets. The baggage was all in the emptied baggage car. The conductor waves to the engineer to go. A toot of the whistle. The bell starts clanging loudly. More steam hisses from the cylinders. Clouds of smoke shoot up into the air. The drive wheels spin, but the wheels don't move. The engineer shakes his head, and he pulls a lever, and it shoots sand on the tracks, and he tries again. And this time the wheels grab. And very slowly the train starts to pick up speed across the bridge to the Antietam station. The trains told me that away yonder, where they mysteriously come from, big and interesting things were going on. The trains told me of a swift action coming to the world that would never let me catnap my life away. I knew I'll have to go and see them for myself.
Shepherdstown is just as southern as Virginia. Gertrude, my roommate, is like your cousin from Norfolk. She slides over her R's so easily, you don't know they're there.
There's a lot of fellas I think of. Gordy Clark, Bill Grantham, Charlie Butts Washington, Warren Clark, Jimmy Brown, his brother Bert, Joe Washington. They all became an unbeatable local ball team. Bill's all-around game, and Jimmy's slow curve, and Warren Clark's sinker would have gotten them all into today's major leagues easily. And likewise the Washingtons. But the train only took them as far as Hagerstown to buy some more baseball bats. Old Dick, he retired after 24 years of being a horse with the mail. Even the town paper wrote, "As a village institution, Dick will be missed." He died and was buried in a sinkhole east of Mill Street. Mr. and Mrs. Waddy watched as their kids grew up and went away. LaRue was first, then Peg, Bill, Polly, and finally Blackford, Cootsy, the caboose. The Waddys could throw open the windows now. The house was quiet. The train took their children on to follow the scent of dreams that became their own homes, their own lives. Each night hereabouts, you'd hear it. The train whistle floating by the moon. The Myers girl at the junk remembered lying in bed and listening to the friendly whistles blowing through the night, snuggling under her covers, feeling all was well with the friendly trains going by. In Sharpsburg, Wilmer Moomaw felt his bed tremble on ice-bathed, very cold winter nights with the frozen ground. And at his window, he watched the 2 a.m. Roanoke to Harrisburg run. A single headlight beam piercing the darkness, the rows of lighted passenger coaches flying by, and then a glimpse of a red light on the last car. In February 1957, the Norfolk and Western, the king of steam, said goodbye to all that. In June, Shepherdstown's passenger station was ordered to close. That fall, Julia Waddy took sick and died. Mr. Waddy looked down at his beloved Julia and said, "Julia, darling, I'll be along shortly." 25 days later, the heart that beat to perfect time for the angels stopped. W. Waddy knew those times were over.
One evening as the sun went down and the jungle fire was burning, down the track came a hobo hiking, and he said, "Boys, I'm not turning. I'm headed for a land that's far away, beside the crystal fountains. So come with me, we'll go and see the big rock candy mountains. In the big rock candy mountains, there's a land that's fair and bright, where the handouts grow on bushes, and you sleep out every night. Where the boxcars all are empty, and the sun shines every day on the birds and the bees and the cigarette trees and the lemonade springs, where the bluebird sings in the big rock candy mountains. In the big rock candy mountains, all the cops have wooden legs, and the bulldogs all have rubber teeth, and the hens lay soft-boiled eggs. There the farmers' trees are full of fruit, and the barns are full of hay. And I'm bound to go where there ain't no snow, and the rain don't fall, and the wind don't blow, in the big rock candy mountains. In the big rock candy mountains, you never change your socks, and the little streams of alcohol come a-trickling down the rocks. There ain't no short-handled shovels, no axes, spades, or picks, and I'm bound to stay where they sleep all day, where they hung the Turk that invented work, in the big rock candy mountains. In the big rock candy mountains, all the jails are made of tin, and you can walk right out again as soon as you are in. Why, the brakemen have to tip their hats, and the railroad bulls are blind. There's a lake of stew and a gin lake too, you can paddle all around 'em in a big canoe, in the big rock candy mountains.